They say the most surprising turns in life don't come crashing through the front door. They sneak in quietly, while you're doing something mundane, like fixing a leaky pipe under someone's sink. I never expected anything out of the ordinary. When I pulled up to that small yellow house on the edge of town, I was just there to work. I wasn't looking for anything new, certainly not someone new. But by the time I'd packed up my toolbox and wiped the sweat off my brow, my entire understanding of what love looks like, of what commitment feels like, had been flipped upside down. Because standing barefoot in her kitchen with flour on, her hands and years behind her eyes, she looked me dead in the face and asked, "Would you take me as your wife at 52? I'm serious. It wasn't a joke. And I knew right then, nothing about this job was going to be routine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started like any other Tuesday. I had a double-booked afternoon, a lukewarm thermos of coffee in the passenger seat, and just enough gas to get me to both jobs if I didn't take a wrong turn. I pulled up to the address around noon, a modest little place with chipping paint, and a yard full of dandelions. It didn't look like much from the outside, one of those houses that somehow looked smaller than it probably was. But something about it made me slow down before knocking. Maybe it was the wind chimes dancing quietly near the porch light, or the cat watching me from the windowsill like it already knew something I didn't. The work order said, kitchen sink leaking, possibly pipe replacement. Client, Marie. That's all I had to go off of. Just a first name and a task. She answered the door like she'd been waiting forever. Not in a desperate way, but like she'd finally opened the chapter of a book she loved and knew every word to. Her hair was silver, not in the dyed trendy way, but in the real, I earned this shade of moonlight. She had lines around her mouth and eyes, the kind you only get from years of smiling through hard days. Her voice was warm and careful when she said hello, like she didn't want to scare off whatever moment was unfolding between us. She moved aside to let me in, and the scent of cinnamon and old wood welcomed me before her words did. The kitchen was a mess. Not dirty, just full of drying herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars of homemade preserves stacked neatly along the windowsill, and a pot of something bubbling on the stove that made my stomach growl before I'd even introduced myself. She laughed when she heard it. Not a giggle, but one of those deep, lived-in laughs that made you want to earn another one. She offered me tea before I even took my tools out, and when I declined, she said, "Suit yourself," like we were already old friends, and she knew I'd regret it later. The sink was worse than I expected. The whole underside was rusted out, the drain was patched with duct tape, and the wood beneath had gone soft from years of slow leaks. I told her it'd take longer than the hour I'd estimated, maybe 2 or 3 if I had to replace the entire pipe. She nodded like that was fine by her. "Take all the time you need. I don't get many visitors," she said, stirring her pot with one hand and sipping her tea with the other. It was only then I realized she wasn't nervous about having a stranger in her home. She was comfortable with quiet, comfortable with presence. As I worked, she moved around the kitchen like she was painting a scene. Everything she did had a rhythm, chopping vegetables, humming to herself, feeding the cat that apparently had a schedule stricter than mine. Every now and then, she'd ask if I needed anything. A towel, a flashlight, another hand to hold something. Steady. I kept telling her I was good, but she kept asking anyway. Not because she doubted me, but because she knew the value of offering. I started talking more than usual. I don't know why. I normally kept quiet on jobs, focused on the task, got in and got out. But something about her kitchen, about her, made it easy to fill the silence. I told her about my truck problems, about my sister's new baby, even about the old dog I lost last winter. She listened like it all mattered. Like even the smallest details of my day were chapters in a story she was eager to read. Hours passed, but I barely noticed. The light shifted outside, the shadows on the walls growing longer, and before I knew it, I was packing up my tools and wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. She poured me a glass of cold tea and sat across from me at the tiny round table in the corner of the kitchen. "Most folks just fix the pipe and leave," she said with a smile. "You took your time." I shrugged, Unsure how to explain, it wasn't just about the pipe. It was something else. She leaned forward then, resting her chin in her hand, and said something that still sits with me like a stone at the bottom of a quiet river. You know, I used to think love was all about timing. But maybe it's just about presence. About showing up, even if it's late. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just nodded. And then, as I stood to leave, she said the thing that started it all. Would you take me as your wife at 52? I'm serious. I laughed at first. Not because I thought she was joking, but because I wasn't sure how else to respond. She didn't laugh, though. She just looked at me, eyes calm and honest, like she was offering something both ridiculous and sacred. And that's when I knew. I wasn't walking away from this one. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I stood there longer than I probably should have, holding my toolbox in one hand and a glass of half-drunk tea in the other, completely disarmed by the way she said it. There was no teasing in her voice, no flirtatious lilt, just the sort of bold vulnerability that leaves no room for sarcasm. Her words hadn't been said in jest. They came from a woman who had long ago stopped caring about games. A woman who had learned that life was too short to dance around the things that matter. And maybe that's what shook me more than the question itself. How fearless she was in asking it. I looked into her eyes, warm but steady, and I saw something that wasn't just about me or the moment. It was about her, about what she'd lived through, about the loneliness that didn't scream but hummed quietly through a house that was far too full of stories to only have one chair at the kitchen table. She didn't rush to explain herself or laugh it off. She just sat there, eyes locked onto mine like she was holding her breath. Not for an answer, but for acknowledgement. And in that strange, fragile moment, I didn't have a single polished sentence to offer. So I sat back down, slowly, silently, still clutching my toolbox like it might help me carry the weight of the conversation I didn't know how to have. The room suddenly felt warmer, heavier. I set my glass down and cleared my throat, not to speak, but to give myself permission to think. I wasn't someone who got flustered easily. I'd been through enough jobs, enough chaotic households, enough loud clients and unpredictable days to know how to keep my cool. But nothing in my life had prepared me for a woman like Marie. Someone who could turn a casual Tuesday into a soul-level confrontation without ever raising her voice. She finally looked away, not in defeat, but in the same way you close a book after reading a powerful line, knowing it would linger long after the page had turned. You don't have to answer, she said, standing slowly and walking toward the sink to rinse her mug. It was a moment, that's all. I watched her, move, steady and graceful, and realized how rare it was to meet someone who didn't demand a reaction. She wasn't fishing for flattery or hoping for shock value. She was just being honest, and that honesty came wrapped in years of surviving herself. It made me feel like I was in the presence of someone who had seen everything worth seeing, and still found a way to soften instead of harden. I told her I'd be back the next day, even though the job was technically done. I mumbled something about wanting to double-check the sealant or see how the pipe held up overnight, but we both knew that wasn't the reason. She nodded, said she'd make more tea, and walked me to the door with a look that said nothing, and everything at once. When I got back in my truck, I didn't drive away right away. I just sat there, engine off, staring at the dashboard like it might offer me some wisdom. My hands were still a little damp from the tea glass, and the back of my shirt clung to me from the lingering humidity of her kitchen. But more than anything, I felt unsettled. In a good way, like something in me had been stirred awake after a long sleep. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I went home to my small apartment that night and didn't turn on the TV. I didn't crack a beer or fall into my usual end-of-day routine. I just sat by the window with the lights off, listening to the sound of the city breathing outside, thinking about her words and the way they landed in my chest like an anchor. I knew I wasn't falling in love. Not yet. But I also knew that whatever had started in that kitchen wasn't going to stay there. Something had shifted, and I had no interest in pretending otherwise. The next morning, I got up earlier than usual. I shaved, trimmed the scruff I usually let grow too long, and put on the only clean work shirt that didn't have a stain on it. I don't even know why I cared. It wasn't like I was showing up for a date, but it felt important to be presentable, to show respect, to meet the moment the way it deserved to be met. When I pulled into her driveway, the front door was already open. She was standing in it, holding a steaming mug of tea like she'd been expecting me since sunrise. I hadn't called ahead. She hadn't asked me to come, but somehow, the silence between us had turned into an unspoken invitation. She stepped aside, and I walked in like I belonged there. This time, I noticed more details. The way her slippers barely made a sound on the wood floor. The faded photograph, pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tiny rooster. The notes scribbled in pencil beside the stove. Measurements, recipes, reminders. There was a life here, lived fully and without apology. And for reasons I couldn't yet name, I wanted to know more of it. I crouched under the sink again, just for show, tightening a nut that didn't really need it, buying myself time to settle into the space again. She didn't ask questions. She just moved about her kitchen with the same quiet rhythm as the day before, humming under her breath and occasionally glancing over with a smile that felt more like a reassurance than a flirtation. Eventually, I stood and wiped my hands on a rag, leaning against the counter as she poured us both fresh tea. "You really meant it, didn't you?" I asked. "What you said yesterday." She didn't blink. Every word. And that's when I realized something important. Her question wasn't about me. It wasn't a proposal in disguise. It wasn't a test. It was a declaration, a statement of self-worth from someone who had spent too many years dimming her own light. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was asking to be seen. And for the first time in a long time, I wanted to be the one who I did. The strange thing about moments like those, where a single sentence changes the entire rhythm of a day, is that they don't always announce their impact right away. Sometimes, they just settle into the bones of your memory like a quiet draft beneath the floorboards. You go on with your life, you keep doing the small things, wiping your boots before stepping in, tightening bolts that don't need tightening, sipping tea even though you're more of a coffee person. And yet, everything feels a little different. That's how it was with Marie. I didn't wake up the next day with a heart full of poetry, or a sudden urge to carve our initials into a tree. But I did notice things. I noticed how her house didn't echo like other empty houses did. There was warmth in it, even in the silence. I noticed how she always moved with intent. Not the hurried kind that comes from being busy, but the measured kind that comes from choosing how to spend your time. And I noticed how she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Curious. Yes, but never needy. She wasn't watching for what I would do next. She was simply witnessing what I already was. That day, I stayed longer than I needed to. I told her I wanted to patch the corner under the sink even though it wasn't part of the original repair. She didn't argue. She just set out a plate of apple slices and a small bowl of peanut butter, like she already knew I hadn't eaten lunch. There was something intimate about the gesture, but not in the romantic sense. It was more maternal, more human. Like she saw through the calloused hands and paint-stained jeans and recognized something soft underneath, something that didn't get fed often. As I worked, she sat at the kitchen table writing on yellow notepad paper. Her pen made a gentle scratch against the surface, and every now and then she'd pause to look out the window, like she was listening, to thoughts she hadn't heard in a while. It struck me that she was a woman who had built an entire life around being okay with herself. And that kind of solitude, not loneliness, but chosen solitude, was rare. You meet a lot of people who fill their time with noise, with distractions, with the desperate company of others just to avoid sitting with their own stillness. But not Marie. She wore solitude like a second skin. We didn't talk much that afternoon. But when I finished, I found myself lingering. Not out of obligation, but out of something quieter and harder to name. She offered me another cup of tea, and I accepted, even though my mind kept trying to remind me of all the other places I was supposed to be. The truth was, none of those other places felt half as grounding as that kitchen. I asked her what she'd been writing, and she said it was a letter to her sister. We're not close, she admitted. But sometimes writing helps me figure out if the distance is worth crossing. I nodded. I didn't know what to say, but I understood the feeling. There are people we drift from, not out of anger, but out of sheer exhaustion. You get tired of trying to be heard in places where no one's really listening. And when Marie said that, I realized she wasn't just talking about her sister. She was talking about all the times she had spoken softly in rooms where people only responded to loudness. Maybe that's why she liked having me around. I didn't ask her to be louder. By the time I packed up, the sun was already slanting low through the blinds. She stood in the doorway as I loaded my tools into the truck, and when I turned to say goodbye, she didn't ask when I'd be back. She just said, "Take care of yourself out there." And I felt that sentence wrap around my ribs in a way I couldn't explain. That night I didn't go home right away. I drove out to the overlook just past the old mill, parked, and sat on the hood of my truck watching the town from a distance. The lights blinked on one by one, little pockets of life nestled between hills. I thought about how many people were out there, rushing through days, trying to outrun regrets, looking for something they couldn't name. And then I thought about Marie's question, and how it had become less of a proposition and more of a lens, something I kept seeing the world through. What if love didn't come crashing in like lightning, but crept in like sunrise? What if it wasn't about timing or age or appearances, but about safety, about the comfort of being seen exactly as you are and knowing you're welcome anyway? Thought about calling her that night. Not to say anything specific, just to hear her voice maybe, but I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch out like a bridge being built slowly between us, plank by plank. Not rushed, not forced, just steady. The next morning, I woke to find a text from her. No emojis, no punctuation. Just, "I hope you're breathing easy today." I read it 3 times, then I texted back, "I am now." And it was true. I spent that day doing smaller jobs, but my mind wasn't in any of them. I kept picturing her kitchen, the yellow notepad, the apple slices, the way she looked at me when she asked if I'd stay, even at 52. It wasn't about age. It never had been. It was about presence, about consistency, about the kind of man who shows up not just when it's convenient, but when it matters. And I couldn't stop wondering, was I that man? Did I want to be? Or had I spent so many years on the move that I'd forgotten how to stop and choose something real? By the time I got home, I knew I couldn't wait until the next excuse to see her. So I drove over again. No toolbox, no invoice. Just me. She answered the door wearing the same apron from before, her hands dusted in flour. "I was making banana bread," she said. "You came at the perfect time." And in that moment, I realized I didn't just want to fix things in her house. I wanted to build something with her. Something that didn't need blueprints or measurements. Just time and trust. The scent of banana bread wrapped around me the second I stepped through her doorway. Thick and warm and strangely nostalgic, like memories I didn't know I'd lost coming home to roost. There was something about the way her kitchen smelled that day. It wasn't just the bread or the cinnamon she'd added even though the recipe didn't call for it. It was the way that smell wrapped around everything, filled the corners, and settled into the bones of the place, like it belonged there, like maybe I belonged there too. She didn't say much as I took off my jacket and hung it on the back of the same chair I'd sat in just a few days ago. Her hands moved with the same quiet rhythm as before, rinsing dishes, folding the towel just so, and I watched her in the soft kind of silence that feels like music. She poured us both mugs of tea and set the bread down between us, not sliced, not plated, just fresh from the oven on a worn wooden board with a knife beside it. I could tell she wasn't trying to impress me, and that was maybe the most disarming thing of all. We sat like that for a while, saying very little but hearing everything. I don't know when the shift happened, when the air between us went from familiar to something just a little charged, like static before a summer storm. It wasn't tense, but it was present. A hum under the surface. I asked her if she'd ever lived anywhere else, and she told me she'd once tried to move to Portland when she was younger, chasing a job and a dream, but the city never felt like home. It was all concrete and rushing people, she said. I missed being able to hear the wind in the trees. I told her I understood that more than I could explain. She smiled and said she knew I did. That smile did something to me. It didn't light a fire. It planted something deeper, slower, like roots. After we finished the bread, I stood to rinse my plate, and she didn't stop me. There was no performance between us, no careful choreography of guest and host. Just ease. And when I turned around, she was leaning against the counter, arms folded, eyes soft. "You didn't come here to fix anything today," she said. I nodded. "Nope." Her head tilted slightly, and there was this flicker of something, curiosity maybe, or caution. "So why did you come?" I thought about lying, about deflecting with humor, or brushing it off with some vague answer. But instead, I looked her in the eye and told the truth. "Because I missed your company." The words felt heavier than they sounded, like they carried more meaning than either of us had planned for. She didn't rush to respond. She let them sit there for a beat, maybe two, before she nodded. "I missed yours too." There was no music playing, but the silence had rhythm. It pulsed in the space between our steps as we moved from kitchen to living room, carrying our tea, settling onto the old love seat like it was something we'd done 100 times before. We talked for hours, not about anything in particular, just stories of our childhoods, favorite books, recipes that went horribly wrong. She told me she once set an entire pot of rice on fire, and I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my tea. I told her about the time I built a treehouse that collapsed under my brother's weight, and we both laughed until our stomachs hurt. It wasn't just the stories. It was the way we listened. Really listened. Not waiting to talk. Just taking in each word like it mattered. Because it did. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the floor, I realized I hadn't looked at my phone once all day. That never happened. My days were usually tracked in tasks, reminders, notifications, but with Marie, time had no edge. It just flowed. I should have left. I knew that. I had calls to return, jobs to confirm, errands that wouldn't run themselves. But my feet didn't move, and neither did hers. There was a magnetism in the quiet that held us both in place. At one point, she reached for a blanket on the armrest and draped it over our legs without a word. It wasn't flirtation. It was something gentler. A signal. An invitation to stay. So I did. Eventually, the room went dark except for the soft light from a lamp in the corner. I told her I should get going, and she nodded, but didn't move. "You'll come back?" she asked, and the vulnerability in her voice hit me like a wave. Not desperation, just honest hope. I said yes. Of course I'd come back, and as I stood and reached for my coat, she followed me to the door and paused. "I meant what I said the other day," she said. "About being 52. About asking someone to stay." I nodded. "I know." She searched my face like she was still waiting for me to flinch or laugh or give her a reason to regret saying it. But I didn't. I looked at her the way you look at something beautiful that doesn't know it's beautiful. "I don't care how old you are," I said. "I care how I feel when I'm with you." That night, I drove home through the quiet back roads with the windows cracked just enough to let the cool air in. And as the trees blurred past, I realized I felt lighter. Not in the way people mean when they say they're happy, but in the way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for so long, and someone finally says, "Let me help." That's what she did. She helped. Just by being herself. No expectations, no demands, just honesty, and tea and banana bread and laughter. And somehow that was more than enough. Maybe it always had been. Maybe we've all just been taught to look for something flashier, louder, more complicated. But maybe love, real love, was quiet, steady, present, like her, like that kitchen, like the feeling I couldn't name but didn't want to let go of. The following week passed in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely natural, as if my usual life, filled with schedules, site visits, phone calls, and endless hardware, store receipts, had been quietly put on pause while another kind of life, slower and more deliberate, gently took its place. I found myself thinking about Marie at odd moments, like when I was measuring drywall or mixing concrete, catching the faintest whiff of cinnamon in the air that reminded me of her kitchen, or hearing a laugh from a passing stranger that held just the right melody to echo hers. She didn't demand space in my mind, but she occupied it anyway, not loudly, not insistently, but with the same quiet presence she had in person. I kept telling myself it was just a moment, a passing connection, something I would look back on fondly, but ultimately let drift away with time. And yet there was something rooted in it, something that refused to be dismissed as fleeting. I suppose part of me knew I would see her again, and not just because she asked, but because I wanted to. Because there was something magnetic in her honesty, in her eyes, in the way she spoke with softness but never weakness. She wasn't trying to be anything, and maybe that's what made her so rare. When I did go back, it was under the pretense of finishing the last part of the kitchen job. A final touch-up near the sink, a realignment of the overhead cabinet doors, nothing that couldn't wait. But I used it as my excuse anyway. I knocked once out of habit, but she was already opening the door before my knuckles hit the wood. "I was just about to put the kettle on," she said, stepping aside. I smiled and walked in like I belonged. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught dust motes in midair, making the whole place look golden and soft around the edges. I noticed she'd rearranged a few things, moved the coffee mugs, added a small plant on the windowsill. It looked like a home again. Or maybe I was just seeing it differently now. As I got to work tightening the hinges, she moved around me with the same quiet grace, slicing fruit, pouring tea, humming a tune I didn't recognize. She didn't hover, or ask unnecessary questions. She let me work, and I let her exist beside me, and there was a comfort in that parallel motion. At one point, I asked her if she always cooked this much, or if I just happened to be the lucky one. She laughed and said she'd gotten back into the habit recently, now that the house didn't feel so empty anymore. She didn't say it to flatter me, and I didn't take it as such. It was a truth laid bare, simple, direct, without any lace or makeup. When I finished the last adjustment, I stood back and admired the cabinet like I'd just carved it from marble. She looked at it, then at me, and grinned. "Perfect," she said. And I realized she wasn't talking about the cabinet. We sat again at the small kitchen table, her tea steeping in a glass mug, the leaves swirling lazily like dancers at a ball. She told me about the old woman who used to own the house before her, a friend of her mother's who left it to Marie in her will, saying it needed someone with a warm soul to keep it alive. I found that detail fitting. The house didn't feel like a place that had been bought. It felt adopted, loved. She asked about my work, and for the first time in a long while, I talked about it without a sense of fatigue. I told her what I loved about it, solving problems with my hands, the satisfaction of making something functional, the way people looked at a fixed faucet like it was a miracle. She listened like every word mattered, like the details weren't boring or mechanical but clues to who I was beneath the surface. And when she said, "You're not just fixing things, you're giving people peace of mind," I didn't know what to say, because it was the kind of compliment that saw past what you did and into why you did it. The hours drifted by like leaves on water. We talked about music, and I admitted I hadn't gone to a live show in years. She reached behind a cabinet and pulled out an old record player and a small stack of vinyls, asking if I'd ever heard Sam Cooke on actual wax. I hadn't, so she placed the needle carefully on the groove, and the crackle before the first note sent a chill up my spine. The music filled the room in a way no speaker ever could, warm and alive and imperfect. And when she reached for my hand, gently, not to pull me to my feet, but just to hold it, I didn't hesitate. We sat there, fingers intertwined, as You Send Me played in the background, and I realized I hadn't felt this kind of quiet connection in years. Maybe ever. It wasn't lust. It wasn't fantasy. It was two people finding the same rhythm, without having to search for it. She didn't ask me to stay that night, and I didn't presume to linger. But when I stood to leave, she walked me to the door and said, "Don't wait too long next time." I promised I wouldn't, and I meant it. On the drive home, I played that same Sam Cooke song through my car, speakers. It didn't sound the same, but the memory of her hand in mine made up the difference. I didn't know what we were becoming. I didn't have a name for it, but I knew it mattered. And sometimes that was enough. As I pulled into my driveway and sat in the stillness of the parked car, I thought about the question she'd asked days earlier. Would you take me as your wife at 52? I hadn't answered then. Not really. But the way things were unfolding, maybe I already had. The days that followed took on a shape I hadn't expected, but welcomed more than I could explain. What began as a simple home renovation job had quietly shifted into something else entirely, though I wouldn't have been able to put a label on it even if someone pressed me to. It wasn't romance in the conventional sense, not yet, but it was undeniable closeness, an emotional tether that pulled me back to Marie's house each time without needing an excuse. I told myself I was checking in to make sure the cabinets were still aligned, that the water pressure hadn't mysteriously dropped again, or that maybe she needed help moving some of the heavier kitchen boxes she kept meaning to unpack. But none of those tasks really existed. I showed up because I wanted to, because sitting across from her with the smell of fresh herbs and black tea drifting through the room felt more like home than anything I had in my actual house. And when we spoke, it was never forced or idle. The conversations carried weight, memories shared, fears admitted, laughter that came not from jokes but from small, human moments that hit just right. One morning, I arrived to find Marie in the backyard, not expecting me, her hands buried deep in the soil of a raised garden bed she'd been building slowly over the last week. Her gloves were dirt-covered, her hair tied back with a faded red bandana, and her face was glowing from both the sun and the sweat of effort. When she saw me, she didn't jump up or apologize for being unready. She simply smiled and said, "You ever plant tomatoes?" I shook my head. She patted the soil beside her and said, "Well, today's your lucky day." And so I knelt beside her, ruining my jeans without a second thought, letting her show me how deep the roots should go, how to recognize when soil was too wet or not wet enough, and how patience, real patience, was the only secret to making anything grow. It felt like a metaphor, but neither of us said it out loud. That afternoon, we shared lunch on the back steps, paper plates resting on our knees, the breeze tugging gently at the loose strands of her hair. She spoke about her younger years, not in a nostalgic way, but with reflection, grounded honesty. She'd been married once, briefly, a man she'd loved with her whole heart, but who didn't know what to do with someone who wouldn't shrink herself to fit his expectations. "He wanted a mirror," she said quietly, "but I've always been more of a window." That line stayed with me for hours, maybe still is. I shared my own history too, nothing too dramatic, but honest. A long-term relationship that had dissolved, slowly, over time, not from betrayal or scandal, but the slow erosion that comes when two people stop seeing each other clearly. She nodded, not to judge, but to acknowledge. Like she knew exactly what that kind of loneliness looked like. After lunch, she asked if I wanted to help her clean out the garage, which I quickly learned was code for, "Let's open a bottle of wine and look through dusty boxes of forgotten memories." And that's exactly what we did. We uncovered old records, forgotten clothes from the 90s, a pair of rollerblades she swore she used to be amazing at, and a stack of old Polaroids, from what looked like the best beach trip no one had ever told me about. She let me into those memories without hesitation, describing the people in the photos like introducing me to her past, not as someone on the outside looking in, but someone she was actively allowing in. At one point, she handed me a photo of her younger self, sun-kissed skin, oversized sunglasses, a laugh frozen mid-motion, and said, "She was a little reckless, but she had heart." I looked at the photo and then at her and said, "Looks like she still does." She looked away, not to avoid the compliment, but to give it space. The rest of the day moved slowly, the kind of slow that doesn't feel like wasted time, but rather proof that time itself is willing to pause for something meaningful. As the sun dipped lower and the garage was finally somewhat manageable, she lit a few candles, and we sat on the porch without saying much. The silence between us had never been uncomfortable. If anything, it was a kind of language all its own. She sipped her wine and looked out over the garden. "I didn't think I'd be here again," she said softly. "Feeling like this. Open." I nodded, understanding more than I could explain. "Me either," I replied. And it was true. I had walked into her life through the front door carrying a toolbox, And somewhere along the way, I'd put the tools down and stayed for something that couldn't be fixed. Because it wasn't broken. It was waiting. Waiting for someone willing to slow down and listen. When I finally left that evening, the sky already blanketed in stars. She walked me to the truck, same as always. She stood there, arms folded, as I climbed into the cab and, just before I started the engine, she said, "You know, I never asked, what brought you to this kind of work?" I paused, hand hovering over the ignition. "Honestly," I said. She nodded. "It's the one place I feel useful, needed maybe. Like I leave things better than I found them." She smiled then, warm and knowing. "You do," she said. "You really do." And with that, I drove off into the night, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, but certain that whatever it was, I would find my way back to her porch, her kitchen, her world. Because what we were building together might not have been part of the original blueprint, but it was becoming the most important project of my life. The days began to blur into each other. Not in a monotonous way, but like brushstrokes on a canvas, slowly forming a picture neither of us dared to describe out loud. I found myself waking up with more energy. Not because I was particularly well rested, but because there was something to look forward to. Something rooted in simplicity and yet heavy with meaning. Every time I stepped through her gate or heard the familiar creak of her front door, it felt less like visiting a client and more like returning to some forgotten part of myself. The kitchen work had transitioned from tasks to moments, and Marie was no longer just the woman who had hired me. She had become a constant in my thoughts, the kind that lingered well after I left and showed up in dreams where we weren't fixing. Anything but simply existing, side by side, effortlessly. One afternoon, I arrived to find her already halfway through painting the cabinets, flecks of green dotting her arms and cheek. She didn't even look up right away, just said, "You're late," with a crooked grin, and handed me a brush as if I had been expected hours earlier. Without a word, I dipped it into the can and started helping. The room smelled of fresh paint, and lemon cleaner, and somewhere in the background, an old jazz record played from her Bluetooth speaker. Soft saxophone wrapping around us like silk. We didn't talk much during the work, and we didn't need to. Our rhythm had become second nature. I knew when she needed help reaching the higher cabinets, and she knew when I needed a break before my shoulders gave out. There was something sacred about that kind of mutual understanding. The kind that forms not through declarations, but through repetition, kindness, and time. That evening, we sat on the floor with paper towels instead of napkins, eating takeout straight from the containers, and laughing about how neither of us had the energy to cook. She told me about her daughter, who lived 2 states away and had recently gotten engaged. I asked her if she was planning to go to the wedding, and she nodded, but her smile faltered. "I haven't seen her in almost 2 years," she admitted. "Things got complicated after the divorce. She took it harder than I thought she would. Not because she missed her father, but because she blamed me for staying so long." I didn't interrupt. She wasn't asking for comfort. She was letting me see her cracks. "Do you think she'll forgive you?" I asked. She shrugged. "I don't know. But I forgave myself, finally. That's what matters most, I think." The weight in her words hung between us, but it wasn't heavy in a burdensome way. It was honest, raw, and brave. Later, while she washed the empty containers and I dried them, she paused and looked over at me. "Do you ever wonder how long people can orbit each other before they collide?" she asked. I thought about it for a second. "Maybe they don't always collide," I said. "Maybe sometimes they just start spinning together." She didn't respond immediately. She just handed me a plate, still dripping, and smiled, like I had answered something she hadn't known how to ask. That night, before I left, she walked me to the door as usual, but instead of her usual, "drive safe," she hesitated. "You don't have to knock anymore," she said quietly. "Just come in." I nodded, heart beating faster than it should have, and walked to my truck feeling like something had just shifted, even though I couldn't say exactly what it was. The next morning I arrived with pastries from the bakery she had mentioned once in passing and 2 cups of her favorite tea. She laughed when she opened the door. Not because it was funny, but because she was surprised I remembered. We ate on the porch, sunlight catching the dust motes in the air like glitter, and for the first time I reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch. In fact, she leaned into my hand just slightly, so subtle I could have imagined it, but I didn't think I had. It was the kind of gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 words and didn't demand a response. After breakfast, we worked on installing the final hardware on the drawers, our movements efficient but easy. Every time our fingers brushed or our eyes met, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that we were both thinking the same thing but too careful to say it aloud. Around noon, she asked if I wanted to take a walk with her to the small community garden just a few blocks down. We left the tools behind and wandered through the quiet neighborhood, passing joggers and retirees and children on bikes who weaved between parked cars like little missiles. The garden was in full bloom, sunflowers towering above everything like golden sentinels, and tomatoes the size of fists hanging heavy on their vines. She pointed out the plot she used to tend and said, "I stopped coming after the divorce. Felt like everything I planted just reminded me of what I lost." I didn't say anything. I just stood beside her until she exhaled and added, "But I'm thinking of starting again. Maybe with someone this time." She turned and looked at me, and I understood what she meant. I reached out and took her hand. Not tightly, not urgently, just enough. That night, as we stood in her now finished kitchen, everything looked different. Not just the cabinets or the new lighting or the freshly painted trim. The space itself had changed. It felt warmer, fuller, like it had been waiting for us to notice it all along. She leaned against the counter and asked, "So, when's your next project?" I paused, weighing the question, wondering if she meant it practically or metaphorically. "Haven't lined anything up yet," I said. "Figured I'd take a little time before jumping into something new." She nodded, then turned toward me fully and said, "Good. Because I have a few ideas for the garden." And just like that, the next chapter had already started writing itself. The garden became our new project, not because it needed us, but because we needed it. There was something healing about dirt under your nails and sweat on your brow, about watching something small and green push through soil and stretch toward the light. Marie had chosen a modest corner plot surrounded by waist-high fencing, just enough to keep out the occasional stray cat or overeager squirrel. She said she wanted to start with herbs and tomatoes. Something simple, something that gave back quickly. I suspected it was less about the produce, and more about proving to herself that she could nurture something and see it thrive. We brought shovels and gloves, picked up seed packets from the local nursery, and even found a little garden gnome that Marie said looked like me if I smiled more. Every afternoon after lunch, we'd walk down together, sleeves rolled up, knees in the dirt, not speaking much but sharing a rhythm that no longer needed words. She showed me how to check the soil, how to water without overdoing it, and how to coax a tomato vine to win just right. I listened, watching her more than the plants, realizing that this was the kind of life I had never pictured but somehow always wanted. The weather grew warmer, and with it came longer days. Sometimes we stayed at the garden until the sun dipped, low, casting gold across her silver hair and making her look like some mythic figure carved out of light and grit. I found myself losing track of time around her, forgetting what day it was, forgetting the things that used to feel urgent. We still talked about everything and nothing, drifting between stories of our pasts and musings about futures we hadn't dared imagine yet. Marie confessed that she'd always dreamed of owning a small bookstore by the water, somewhere quiet with mismatched chairs and coffee that made your heart slow down instead of speed up. I told her about the old truck I'd been meaning to restore. For years, how I'd always imagined taking it across the country. No destination, just the road and time. She smiled and said, "Maybe there's a bookstore somewhere along that route, and maybe it's mine." The thought lingered longer than it should have, like a dream you wake up from but can't quite shake. One evening, after a full day spent digging and planting, we returned to her house and sat on the back steps, sharing a single cold beer between us. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, and the distant sound of a lawnmower hummed like background music to our stillness. Marie looked out over the small patch of her backyard and said, almost absently, "This is the most peace I've had in years." I didn't respond. I just reached out and rested my hand on hers, not to make a statement, but to say I understood. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand and intertwined her fingers with mine. her thumb gently brushing against my knuckle. There was no need for a grand gesture or declaration. That simple, quiet connection said enough. As summer edged closer, so did something else. Something unspoken, but palpable. There was a pull between us, not like gravity, but like a tide slowly rising. It was in the way she leaned in a little closer when we sat together, the way her voice softened when she said my name, the way I noticed the curve of her smile before anything else in the room. I started staying later after the day's work. Not out of obligation, but because I didn't want to leave. Dinner became a routine. Sometimes she cooked. Other times we ordered in and watched old movies on her worn-out couch, legs just barely touching, breaths sinking without trying. She had this habit of quoting lines under her breath a second before they were said on screen, and I never told her how much I loved it. There was something comforting in her predictability, something sacred in knowing someone well enough to anticipate their next move, and loving them all the more for it. Then one night, the air thick with humidity and the scent of blooming magnolias, she looked at me as we cleaned up dinner, her hands still wet from the sink. "Do you ever wonder what people see when they look at us?" she asked. I paused, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" She dried her hands slowly, looking down before meeting my gaze. "I mean, do they see something strange? Something mismatched?" I took a breath and stepped closer. "I see peace," I said. "I see someone who makes sense in a world that doesn't." Her eyes softened. "Even with the gray hair and the wrinkles?" she teased. I touched her cheek, traced the edge of her jaw gently. "Especially with the gray hair and the wrinkles." That was the night we kissed for the first time. No build-up, no hesitation. Just the meeting of two souls who had already done the hard work of knowing and still chose to lean in. Her lips were warm and tentative, like she hadn't kissed anyone in years and had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted for nothing more than her presence. We didn't say anything afterward. We just stood there in her kitchen, arms around each other, breathing in the newness of a moment that had been waiting to happen for far too long. It wasn't electric, it was quiet, like the hush of snowfall or the first light of dawn, soft, certain, and utterly unforgettable. The next morning I made breakfast for her for the first time. Burned the toast, undercooked the eggs, but she ate every bite and said it was perfect. I knew it wasn't, but I also knew she wasn't talking about the food. That day, we didn't go to the garden. We stayed home, danced barefoot in the kitchen to music from decades past, slow and awkward, but real. It felt like all the pieces were finally in place. Like we had arrived somewhere neither of us had planned but both desperately needed. The days passed not with urgency, but with a rhythm that made time feel less like something to beat and more like something to savor. The house had started to feel different, warmer somehow, though the thermostat stayed the same. There was a comfort in knowing where the mugs were, which chair creaked the loudest, and which window caught the best light. In the morning, what began as me showing up to fix a leaky sink had turned into something else entirely. A quiet companionship that neither of us named, but both of us felt. Marie moved around the house with a calm that settled everything it touched. Her presence didn't fill a room in the way loud personalities do. It steadied it, like an anchor. And somewhere along the way, without ceremony or announcement, I found myself becoming part of the rhythm she lived by. We weren't trying to impress each other. We weren't dressing up or talking in circles or waiting for the right moment to speak. We were simply coexisting and doing it in a way that made sense. She had a morning ritual that I learned to anticipate. Coffee at 7 a.m., classical music humming softly from the radio, her hair tied up in a messy bun she didn't bother perfecting. She didn't talk much in those early hours, and I didn't make her. I sat across the table, nursing my own mug, reading whatever old magazine she had lying around, or sometimes just watching her eyes track the garden outside the window. There was peace in the silence, and that kind of peace doesn't happen often. Not with strangers, not with friends, and certainly not with someone you're beginning to care for in a way you don't yet have language for. We never really spoke about the age difference. It was there, obvious to anyone with eyes. But it wasn't something that needed explaining. She was 52. She said it plainly, without apology or pride. I was younger by a stretch, but not in the way that mattered. Life had aged me in ways the calendar couldn't measure, and she never looked at me like I was missing something she needed. The garden became our joint obsession. It was hers before, but now she let me in, gave me a pair of gloves, showed me how to handle the shears, let me choose where to plant the lavender. The soil was dry, stubborn in some places, but we worked together, tilling, watering, weeding. Some days we didn't say much. Other days, we talked about everything: her regrets, my mistakes, the kind of meals we'd cook if we had people over more often. She told me about her daughter who lived out of state, rarely visited, caught up in a life too busy for a mother who never asked for much. I told her about my brother who hadn't spoken to me in years. We shared losses like trading cards, not to outdo one another, but to say, I've been there too. It was strange how natural it felt, this constant companionship. No pressure, no awkwardness, no "where is this going" conversation. We were just there. Morning coffee, afternoon chores, evening quiet, rinse, repeat. And I started realizing that the routines we built weren't just passing time, they were making a life, one moment at a time. Then one late afternoon, while we were sitting under the old tree behind her house, the sun stretching long shadows over the grass, she turned to me with that same soft seriousness she used when she talked about things that mattered. "You know," she said, eyes fixed on the horizon, "there's something I never thought I'd say out loud again." I waited. "I used to believe," she continued, "that if someone truly saw me, the real me, the flawed, aging, worn-out me, they'd leave, or worse, they'd stay out of pity." She looked at me then, and I didn't blink. "But lately," she said, "you make me think maybe I was wrong." My throat tightened. I didn't have some poetic response. I just reached out, took her hand, and held it. No squeeze, no promises, just presence. There were no fireworks after that, no dramatic shift, just more days, more moments, more ordinary magic. But something had shifted. The touches lingered longer. The smiles carried more weight. She started leaning into me when she laughed, and I started memorizing the way her eyes wrinkled at the corners. We didn't rush it. We didn't label it. But we both knew. The house, once a space I entered as a worker, had become something different. A sanctuary, a place where I belonged. And when she handed me a spare key one morning and said, "just in case," she didn't have to explain. I knew what it meant. It wasn't about the key. It was about the trust. About the door that was now open, not just to her home, but to something deeper. Mornings began to carry a subtle kind of anticipation, the quiet type that blooms under the surface, unspoken, but undeniable. I would wake without an alarm now, without the need for one, already halfway out of bed before the coffee was even brewing. There was no longer any sense of being a guest or temporary fixture in Marie's world. I moved through her home like it was mine too, familiar with the creak in the hallway floorboards, the temperamental faucet in the downstairs bathroom, and the way the kitchen light flickered when the dishwasher ran. Marie didn't ask me to stay longer, but she didn't need to. The silence said enough. The way she left my coffee mug on the counter every morning, the way her eyes lingered when I laughed, the way her voice softened when she said goodnight, these were all the ways someone says stay without actually saying it. Her garden was beginning to thrive again. The fruits of our quiet labor beginning to bloom and sprawl, tomatoes peeking out on thick vines, herbs clustering beside their wooden markers, the lavender perfuming the breeze in bursts when the wind shifted. She started baking again, something she claimed she hadn't done in years, and I found myself eating homemade banana bread while sitting barefoot on her porch, wondering when exactly my life had made this unexpected but welcome detour. Neighbors began to notice, not with judgment, but with curiosity. An older gentleman from 2 houses down started waving more often, and the woman across the street who walked her golden retriever twice a day always smiled when she saw us outside. There was a moment, brief but meaningful, when Marie introduced me as someone who's been helping with more than just the kitchen. She said it casually, with a shrug and a hint of a smile, and while the words didn't say much, her tone told the whole story. I wasn't just her handyman anymore. I was becoming part of her life's architecture, woven in between the walls I'd helped repair, the drawers I'd realigned, and the garden I'd watched come back to life. But even with all that growing closeness, we never rushed. There was A respect to the way we unfolded toward each other, as if we both understood that what we were building was too meaningful to risk with haste. We didn't need grand declarations or candlelit dinners to prove what we felt. It was in the small things. The way she saved the corner slice of lasagna because she knew it was my favorite. The way I learned to refill the bird feeder before. She even noticed it was low, the way we sat in silence and let it speak for us. One evening, as the sky turned that soft, dusky blue that only happens when the weather is just right, Marie surprised me. We were sitting outside, a bottle of wine between us, a blanket stretched over our legs to ward off the cool breeze. She looked at me, eyes clearer than I'd ever seen them, and said, "You know what scares me?" I shook my head, not wanting to interrupt. The idea that I might be happier now than I've been in years, and that it's temporary. She said it without drama, just honesty. I didn't rush to reassure her. I let the words hang there because I knew exactly what she meant. Happiness, when it finally comes back after being gone so long, feels delicate, fragile. Like a soap bubble you're afraid to touch because you know it might burst. But after a moment, I simply replied, "Maybe that's what makes it real. Because we feel the weight of it now." She nodded slowly, as if my answer settled something inside her. That night, after she went inside, I lingered on the porch a little longer, staring out at the darkened yard, lit only by the faint glow of the garden lights. I thought about all the places I'd lived, all the jobs I'd taken that blurred together like road signs on a long highway, and none of them, none, felt as steady as what I had here. Not because it was flashy or thrilling, but because it was quiet and real and earned. I wasn't used to that kind of permanence, and I wasn't sure I even deserved it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe you don't have to deserve peace. Maybe you just have to stop running from it when it finds you. The days continued in that same gentle rhythm, a quiet unfolding of something neither of us dared name aloud. I would find myself lost in the smallest moments. Marie brushing her hair out of her face while she baked, humming a tune I didn't recognize. The dogs asleep by the fireplace, as if they too had sensed a shift in the house's atmosphere. The old radio she kept in the kitchen playing songs from decades past, sometimes scratchy, sometimes clear, always warm. There was an intimacy in the ordinary, in knowing when she took her tea, how she liked her toast, that she always paused before flipping the last page of a book like she was saying goodbye. And I began to realize that maybe love didn't have to announce itself with grand gestures. Maybe love looked like learning a person's quiet, everyday rhythms and syncing your own heartbeat to match. I had come here to fix something broken, and in doing so, I had accidentally stumbled into something whole. There was a safety in her presence that I hadn't known I was missing. I didn't have to entertain her or impress her. I just had to show up. She saw me in a way no one had before. Not for what I could do with my hands, not for what I could build or repair, but for how I listened, how I showed up, how I stayed. One morning, I caught her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, and the look in her eyes wasn't longing or regret, it was peace. And for a woman who had built a life alone for so long, I knew what it cost her to let someone in again. I never asked what had happened with her husband, because it wasn't my story to pry open. She had offered me slivers in passing, how he'd been distant toward the end, how illness had taken more than just his body, how grief had reshaped her world in ways she never anticipated, but never more than that, and I never needed more. Her silence spoke volumes, and I honored it by not trying to fill it. Instead, I matched her pace, step for step, trusting that if she ever wanted to tell the full story, she would. In the meantime, we built new ones. I helped her repaint the guest room, not because it needed it, but because she said the color felt too heavy. We rearranged the bookshelves in the living room, alphabetically at first, and then, halfway through, by favorite authors instead. She made fun of how seriously I took the placement of the armchair in the corner, until she sat in it one night and admitted it was perfect. It was those little moments that filled the air with something unspoken but undeniable. Neither of us said anything about the future. We didn't need to. But there were signs. My toothbrush in the upstairs bathroom. A drawer cleared for my tools in the hallway closet. A scarf she'd knit for me with my initials stitched clumsily on one end. I never commented on it. I just wore it one morning, without saying a word. And when she noticed, She smiled like I'd handed her a promise. We had fallen into a rhythm that felt like home, not built in haste, but in layers. And yet, beneath it all, I felt a quiet ticking. Not dread, but a sense of knowing that moments like these didn't last forever unless you chose to make them stay. One evening, while the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the porch, Marie turned to me and asked a question that seemed to echo into the sky. "Do you think people can start over at any age?" Her voice wasn't wistful, it was steady. I looked at her, and I didn't hesitate. I think starting over is a myth. I think what we really do is keep building with what we've got. We don't start over. We move forward. She nodded, as if that answer had been waiting inside her all along, just needing someone to give it shape. That night, I watched her fall asleep beside me for the first time, not because anything had shifted dramatically, but because it had slowly, inevitably tilted toward closeness until we were just there. The bed wasn't large, and we didn't touch much. Just a brush of knees, the weight of her breath beside mine, the comfort of knowing we weren't alone. And in the dark, I realized something that made my chest ache in the best way. I didn't want to go back to my old life. I didn't miss the solitude, the wandering, the anonymity. I wanted mornings here, with the radio crackling in the background and her dog at my feet. I wanted evenings spent debating over which wine to open, or which movie from the stack of old DVDs we'd inherited from her sister to watch next. I wanted the ordinary, because the ordinary with her was extraordinary to me. She didn't ask for promises, and I didn't offer any. But as I drifted off to sleep with the smell of lavender and firewood in the air, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever this was, however it had happened, I wasn't going anywhere. The next morning arrived with a quiet sense of normalcy that felt more intimate than any declaration could have. There was no awkwardness, no morning after scramble to re-establish boundaries, just coffee brewing, a soft light spilling through the kitchen window, and Marie humming under her breath as she stirred eggs in a pan. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds longer than I needed to, simply watching her move in her space, the way she paused between steps, as if she were still adjusting to someone else occupying the silence with her. But there was no discomfort, just calm. I walked over, placed my hand gently on her shoulder, and she turned slightly, gave me that small, knowing smile I was coming to recognize as hers, the one she saved for moments like this, quiet and powerful in their own way. We didn't talk much through breakfast, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with things that didn't need words. Shared glances, a passing of the butter, her brushing a crumb off my cheek with her thumb, and somewhere deep in the stillness, I felt the weight of the past loosening its grip, just a bit. After breakfast, we fell into our usual weekend rhythm. I returned to the last remaining cabinet door I'd been putting off refinishing, and she went out back to tend to her garden, muttering something about the basil needing a talking to. Hours passed like minutes, the kind of flow that only happens when you feel completely at ease with your surroundings. At one point, I looked up from my sanding and caught sight of her through the back window, kneeling in the dirt, gloves on, her hat slightly crooked, sunlight painting her in this soft golden glow. And I thought, not for the first time, how this woman had somehow taken my life, this messy, rootless, task-oriented version of it, and turned it into something resembling peace. Not by changing me, but by making space for me to be myself, fully and without conditions. That afternoon, as we sat on the porch sipping lemonade, she asked, almost casually, "Do you ever miss your old routine?" It took me a moment to realize what she meant. The long hours, the open road, the job-to-job simplicity of it all. I thought about it, really gave it space, and then said, "Not really. I think I like the illusion of freedom more than the freedom itself." She nodded, understanding without prying. "It's easy to get used to being untethered," she said, watching a squirrel dart along the fence line. "But sometimes we forget how good it feels to belong somewhere." That word, belong, settled deep in my chest. Because that was it, wasn't it? I didn't just enjoy her company, or admire her strength, or appreciate her hospitality. I felt like I belonged in her world. Like the version of me that existed here was the best one I'd met so far. Later that evening, We found ourselves on the couch, a stack of old photo albums between us. She flipped through them with a kind of detached fondness, pointing out her niece at her 3rd birthday, a family vacation to Oregon, the dog she had before her current one, who apparently hated the mailman and loved watermelon. There was a picture of her late husband, too, tucked between 2 pages like an afterthought. She didn't linger on it, just touched the corner gently with 1 finger and moved on. I didn't ask, she didn't offer, and yet that single moment told me more than any story ever could. She was still grieving in her own way, still carrying that loss like a scar. Not raw, not fresh, but permanent. And yet here she was, sitting next to me, choosing to share the pages of her life without apology or hesitation. I didn't take it lightly. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the room was dim, the lamp casting a warm glow, and she was still sitting beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Not possessive, not demanding, just there. And I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was on borrowed time. I didn't feel like a guest or a visitor or a man who would soon be packing up his tools and moving on. I felt rooted. Not in a dramatic, storybook kind of way, but in a quiet, unshakable knowing. That night, I lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, the rhythm of her breathing anchoring me. I thought about all the years I'd spent drifting, convincing myself that attachment was weakness, that commitments were traps. And now, with her asleep beside me, I saw clearly how wrong I'd been. There was strength in staying, courage in showing up, day after day. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of the future, not of the past, not of becoming someone who cared this deeply. Because if this was what caring looked like, waking up to her humming, fixing a drawer just because it annoyed her, laughing over burnt toast, then I wanted all of it, every ordinary moment, every unspoken promise, every quiet morning and late-night whisper. It was no longer a question of whether I was ready. I already was. And I think, deep down, she knew that too. The morning came with a hush, as if the world around us had agreed to move just a little slower for our sake. There was a softness to the air, that crispness of early spring where the sun hasn't fully committed to warmth, but the chill has started to retreat. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm or some noise, but because something inside me stirred, something that felt like anticipation mixed with gratitude. Marie was still asleep, her face turned toward the window, hair fanned across the pillow, her breathing steady and peaceful. I took a moment just to watch her, to absorb the quiet reality of being here with her. Not as a visitor or a guest, but as someone who now belonged to the rhythm of her mornings. I slipped out of bed quietly, brewed coffee, and stepped out onto the back porch to take in the view that had become more than scenery to me. It had become a kind of grounding. The wind played with the leaves, the birds darted between branches, and everything seemed to hum with gentle life. I sat there, wrapped in a blanket, sipping from a chipped mug she claimed had too many years on it but refused to throw away. As the sun began to lift, so did my thoughts. I found myself thinking about permanence, not in the way I used to, filled with dread or claustrophobia, but with a cautious hope. What if this didn't have to end? What if I didn't have to pack up my tools and walk away once the last hinge was hung or the final coat of paint dried? What if this chapter could simply keep going, unfolding naturally, not tied to some job or agreement, but just because we wanted it to? She found me there not long after, still barefoot, her robe wrapped loosely around her, and that sleepy look of someone who'd just stepped out of a dream. She didn't speak right away, just slid in next to me and rested her head on my shoulder. We stayed like that for a while, letting the moment speak for itself, before she murmured, "You always wake up before me now." I smiled into my coffee. I like having the quiet to think before the day starts. She tilted her head, peering up at me. Dangerous pastime, thinking too much before breakfast. And just like that, the spell broke into laughter, light and easy, as if we'd been sharing mornings like this for decades. We made breakfast together, falling into an unspoken rhythm of passing, reaching, pouring, and stirring, all without instruction. She cracked the eggs. I made the toast. She poured the orange juice, and I plated the food. It was nothing and everything all at once. Afterward, we sat across from each other at the little round table by the window, eating in a quiet that no longer needed filling. She tapped her fork against her plate absent-mindedly, then said, "You know, I've been thinking about something." That sentence, said in that particular tone, always signaled that something personal or vulnerable was coming. I looked up, waiting. She pushed her plate slightly forward and met my gaze. "Have you ever felt like you were standing on the edge of a cliff, not because you were afraid to fall, but because you were afraid you might finally want to stay put?" I didn't answer right away, because the metaphor wasn't lost on me. I knew she wasn't just talking about cliffs or fear. She was talking about us, about this strange, beautiful, evolving connection that had grown in the cracks of an old kitchen project. And so I said, "Maybe the edge isn't about danger. Maybe it's just the best view we've had in a long time." She smiled, but it was the kind that carried something deeper. Hope, maybe, or relief, or both. The rest of the day unfolded with that quiet hum of new understanding. We went about our separate tasks. She took a call from her sister, and I tinkered with the railing on the back steps, but everything we did felt subtly connected, like we were operating within the same current. Later, as the sun began to dip and cast long shadows across the porch, we sat down with our second round of coffee and let the stillness wash over us. She watched the horizon. I watched her. And then, without preamble, she said, "I used to think 52 was the beginning of the end, that people like me had already lived their big story, and everything from here on was just filler." I didn't interrupt. I just listened. She continued, her voice soft. "But you being here, it's made me realize maybe the middle of the story can be just as meaningful, maybe even better." I leaned forward slightly, my voice low. "You're not in the middle. You're in the part where everything finally starts to make sense." She looked at me then, really looked. And something in her eyes changed, not in a dramatic way, but like a door slowly opening after being stuck for years. She reached across the table, placed her hand over mine, and simply said, "Stay." No qualifiers. No jokes. Just the one word. And in that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about her wanting company or someone to finish projects around the house. It was about her choosing me, not as a placeholder, but as a partner, as someone she wanted in her story, not because she needed rescuing or validation, but because I made her feel seen, whole, alive again. And so I answered her with the only word that felt honest: yes. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I had finally found where I wanted to be. The next morning came with the kind of clarity that doesn't demand attention. It just settles into your bones. There was no rush, no grand moment of decision-making or confessions, just a gentle unfolding of what had already been decided the night before. I awoke with a calm I hadn't felt in years, as though some internal pressure had finally been lifted, and all that remained was the quiet confirmation that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The familiar sounds of the house crept into the bedroom, birds chattering from the trees outside the window, the low gurgle of the coffee maker sputtering to life in the kitchen, and the subtle creak of the hallway floorboards as Marie moved about her mourning. There was something sacred about the way the ordinary had become extraordinary in this space with her. I took a minute to absorb the light spilling across the room, golden and slow, before stepping out of bed and moving through the house like I belonged. Because now, I did. In the kitchen, Marie was leaning over the sink, rinsing berries, her hair pulled back with a pencil and her robe half-tied, as though she'd started the morning but hadn't finished committing to it. She looked up and smiled with that ease that didn't need ceremony anymore. There was nothing performative in our interactions, no pressure to impress or entertain, just presence. We had breakfast together without fanfare, the way people who've built a rhythm around each other do. There was a simplicity in the way we passed the jam, refilled each other's coffee, made space without speaking. It wasn't the kind of love you see in movies with fireworks or swelling music. It was the kind that's earned through presence, respect, and moments that feel small, but add up to something unshakable. After breakfast, I returned to a few remaining tasks around the house, not because she asked, but because it felt right to finish what I'd started. The last section of the kitchen trim needed paint, a squeaky cabinet door needed oil, and there was a loose plank on the back deck I had put off repairing when things were still uncertain. With every brushstroke, every screw tightened, I wasn't just fixing things. I was laying down roots in my own way, investing in this life we were building together, piece by piece. Marie spent her time that morning going through old photo albums in the sunroom. I caught a glimpse of her through the window, flipping pages slowly, sometimes smiling to herself, other times just gazing long and quiet at the faces and memories frozen in time. It made me wonder how much history lived in her. How many stories, heartbreaks, triumphs, and transformations had shaped the woman I now sat across from each morning. We didn't talk about the past much. Not because we avoided it, but because we didn't need to. The present was loud enough. But in that moment, I felt a pull to know her deeper. Not just the her I had met, but the her she had become through everything before. That afternoon, I sat beside her as she gently closed the last album, the afternoon light cutting across the room in soft stripes. I asked her, with sincerity and curiosity, what her happiest memory was. She paused, her finger still resting on the cover of the album, then tilted her head slightly as if searching through the vast library of her life for just one reel to play. Finally, she said, "It was a Sunday. I was 16. My mom had made cinnamon rolls from scratch, and the whole house smelled like vanilla and sugar. My dad danced with her in the kitchen, flour on his shirt. It wasn't grand, just complete, like the world paused to let us remember how much we belonged to each other." Her voice didn't crack, but her eyes shimmered. I realized then how deeply rooted she was in the act of remembering, how much of her strength came from knowing what she'd loved and lost and still choosing to open herself again. I placed my hand over hers, and for a long time, we just sat there, letting the quiet wrap around us. Later, as the evening rolled in, we cooked together. Real cooking, not just throwing things into a pan, but moving with care. She taught me how to make her favorite lemon chicken with rosemary, and I showed her how my mother used to toast garlic and butter just until it turned gold before tossing it with green beans. It was messy and fragrant and filled with laughter that echoed through the kitchen like music. We sat on the porch after dinner, full and tired in the best way, listening to the cicadas hum as the night settled. The stars started appearing one by one, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people left awake in the world. She leaned against my shoulder, and I could feel her breath slow. It was in that silence that I realized something important. Not every chapter in life is about action. Some are about being still enough to feel what matters. And that's what this was. A pause between storms. A space where healing didn't have to be loud or visible, but could exist in things like the steady cadence of shared footsteps, or the trust in a quiet gaze. The world outside might have still been chaotic. Bills, responsibilities, aging parents, unanswered questions about what came next. But here, in this small corner of the universe, we had created something solid, something whole, something worthy of protecting. I didn't know what the future held or how this would look a year from now, but I knew this. Whatever came, we would face it side by side. Not because we were obligated to, but because we chose to. Every day, again and again. And in that choosing, love was redefined, not as a single moment of passion or a perfect storybook ending, but as a daily decision to stay, to try, to see each other fully and still say, yes, you, again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so natural, it felt as though it had been playing in the background all along, just waiting for us to hear it. There was no grand ceremony, no formal declaration of our arrangement, but the way we moved through the house said everything. Mornings began with the simple luxury of shared silence, punctuated only by the hum of the coffee machine and the slow rustle of the newspaper as I read it aloud to her from the kitchen table. Marie would water the plants, her robe trailing slightly behind her, hair still tousled from sleep, humming along to some tune from decades past that I couldn't name but now associated with her completely. I'd sneak glances when she wasn't looking, memorizing the way the sunlight caught the lines around her eyes, or how she always bit the inside of her cheek when deep in thought. There was something sacred about witnessing someone in their ordinary rituals, like being trusted with a part of them no one else saw. The kitchen, once just a place for repairs, had become the epicenter of our connection. We tested new recipes, laughed at the ones that failed, and found joy in those tiny domestic victories, like a perfectly crisped roast or a pot of soup that somehow tasted like memory. I built her a shelf for her growing spice collection and found myself lingering near the stove more often, drawn not just by the food, but by the quiet intimacy of sharing creation with someone who made even the mundane feel like art. We began doing projects together around the house, not out of necessity, but as a way to leave our fingerprints in the corners of our shared life. We painted the guest bedroom a warm shade of sage, sanded the banister until it gleamed like new, and spent an entire weekend reorganizing the garage, which turned into more laughter and storytelling than actual productivity. Each task was another stitch in the fabric of a home no longer defined by a floor plan, but by the people inside it. Evenings became our soft landing. Sometimes we played cards at the dining table while jazz records spun on the old turntable in the living room. Other nights we curled up on the sofa with a blanket, watching old movies that made her cry and made me pretend I wasn't tearing up too. She had this habit of falling asleep halfway through the film, her head resting against my shoulder, her hand finding mine unconsciously like muscle memory. I never woke her. I'd sit there long after the credits rolled, the flicker of the screen painting shadows across the room, content to be still if it meant staying close to her. I found myself talking less and listening more, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't want to miss a thing. Marie spoke with a kind of wisdom that didn't come from books or lectures, but from years lived fully, messily, bravely, honestly. She told me about the time she almost moved to Paris in her 20s, the night she drove cross-country on a whim, the years she spent putting everyone else first, and the quiet ache that came with it. I listened not to fix or advise, but just to know her better. And in doing so, I realized how often we underestimate the power of simply being known. One rainy afternoon, we went through old boxes she hadn't touched in years. There were photos of a younger version of her, letters from people she no longer spoke to, trinkets from places she once dreamed of calling home. We laughed at her perm from the 80s, cried a little when she found a card from her late mother, and spent hours piecing together the timeline of a life that had been full even before I arrived in it. There was something healing about honoring each other's pasts without needing to rewrite them. As the season changed, so did something in the air between us, not in a dramatic way, but like a deepening tide. We didn't label it or dissect it. We just let it be. There was no pressure to make proclamations or plan a future with bullet points. We were building something, yes, but it was less about direction and more about depth. One night, as we sat on the back porch wrapped in separate blankets but sharing the same mug of hot cider, she turned to me and said, "You know, I think this is the happiest I've been in years." I didn't say anything right away. I just looked at her, really looked, and thought about how many times people rush past moments like this, always looking for the next milestone. But this quiet, unremarkable moment, was everything. "Me too," I finally said. She smiled, leaned her head on my shoulder, and we watched the wind shake the trees like it was making room for something new. We never really talked about what other people might think. Maybe some would say it was unconventional, that two people in the middle chapters of their lives deciding to write a new one together was strange or impulsive. But we weren't concerned with anyone else's script. This was our story. And every day, it read more like the kind you dog-ear and reread when life gets heavy. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, small disagreements, and reminders that blending two lives isn't seamless. But even in the rough patches, there was respect. And more importantly, there was choice. We chose to show up, chose to forgive, chose to stay. That, I realized, is the kind of love that lasts. Not because it's easy, but because it's chosen over and over again. And somehow, in the quiet rituals, the shared meals, the mended fences, and freshly painted walls, we had found a kind of forever that didn't need rings or promises. It just needed two people willing to build it, one morning at a time. As the leaves outside shifted from green to gold, and the air carried the crispness of autumn on its breath, I began to notice how the rhythm of our life had quietly matured into something far more meaningful than I ever anticipated. It was no longer about the kitchen I had once been hired to repair, or the odd jobs I picked up in between. It had become about us, and how two people, strangers at the start, had somehow grown into a kind of unshakable familiarity. There was no flash or spectacle, nothing that would make headlines or inspire grand romantic ballads, but there was a depth in the way we fit into each other's lives that felt irreplaceable. Mornings had begun to carry their own little rituals. Marie would be the first to rise, putting the kettle on for tea and humming something soft, while I made the bed and folded the throw blankets with the precision of someone who had grown to respect the peaceful order of a shared space. We didn't talk much in those early hours, but we didn't need to. It was enough to be in each other's orbit, to move around the house with a quiet understanding of where the other would be and what needed doing. Sometimes she'd leave me little notes on the counter, tucked into my tool bag, even on the bathroom mirror. Not romantic declarations or anything over the top, just things like, "Remember to eat," or "You left your coffee again, but I still like you." I kept them all, tucked away in a drawer I rarely opened but often thought about. They were proof, in her own handwriting, that I mattered. And I think that mattered more than I knew. Afternoons were our time for projects, not because we had to fix anything urgent, but because creating together gave us both purpose. Marie had recently gotten the idea to turn the attic into a reading nook. She called it her Sky Library. I laid new floorboards and installed extra insulation, while she chose rugs and cushions and picked out books from local thrift shops like she was curating a museum exhibit. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers, and by extension, ours. Watching her lie across that low couch beneath the slanted ceiling, lost in a novel, made me feel like I'd helped carve out a little sanctuary for someone who had never asked for much, but deserved everything. Sometimes I'd sit at the edge and just listen to the pages turn, letting her peace become mine. Marie had this talent for creating moments. On a Wednesday evening that had no special significance whatsoever, she decided to cook a full-course dinner, complete with candles and a makeshift menu she scribbled on a napkin. "Why?" I'd asked, laughing as she shoved a wine glass in my hand. "Because Wednesdays deserve magic too," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And somehow, under the flicker of those cheap candles, and the scent of rosemary chicken filling the kitchen, it did feel like magic. I often found myself watching her when she didn't know, the way she stirred a pot absent-mindedly while staring out the window, or how her brow furrowed when she focused too hard on crosswords, or how she always sang louder when she thought she was alone. I memorized those things like songs I didn't want to forget, and every now and then I'd catch her doing the same with me. There was this one evening, rain tapping softly against the windows, fire crackling in the hearth, both of us wrapped in worn quilts on the couch, where she turned to me out of nowhere and said, "Do you ever think about how none of this was planned? How I could have hired someone else, or you could have said no?" I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. We both recognized how precarious and beautiful the whole thing was, how easily it might not have been, and yet here we were. I told her I did think about it, often, and I told her I was grateful every day for the randomness that brought us together. She smiled, squeezed my hand, and leaned her head against my shoulder like she always did when words had done enough. As the season deepened and colder nights settled in, we began discussing practical things, not because we needed to, but because we wanted to. Should I move in fully? What about combining our finances? Would her daughter, who lived a few states away, be okay with me taking up space in the house that had once belonged to their family alone? These conversations weren't rushed or forced. We let them unfold like everything else between us. Patiently, with care, always ready to pause if either of us needed to catch our breath. I started leaving fewer clothes at my own place and more at hers. My name began appearing on deliveries. I replaced a light switch in the hall without being asked. It was happening. Slowly, deliberately. It was becoming a home not just for her, but for us. And in that process, we both began to relax into something softer than commitment, belonging. We never made a big deal out of defining things. There were no labels or deadlines, just a mutual understanding that whatever this was, it was good. It was real, and it was ours. We were two people living honestly, no pretending, no performing, just showing up for each other every day with all our faults and fears and quiet hopes. And somehow, that felt like the most romantic thing in the world. One afternoon, while organizing the pantry of all things, she looked up from a shelf of mismatched cans and said, "You know, I never imagined myself being this happy at this age." I smiled, reached for her hand, and replied, "Neither did I." We stood there for a while, surrounded by dry goods and spice jars, holding each other like the whole world had finally caught up to the idea that it was never too late to begin again. And in that moment, with the sunlight cutting across the floor and the scent of something warm baking in the oven, I realized that this wasn't a second chance. It was the first one either of us had ever really claimed for ourselves. There's something quietly powerful about the way routine can hold a person's heart together, especially when that routine isn't built out of necessity, but intention. As the days blended into one another with that gentle rhythm only deep connection can create, I noticed how even the smallest details of our time together began to feel like pages from a book I didn't want to put down. We had stopped trying to impress each other long ago, and what remained was something more profound: ease. The kind of ease that lets you laugh without filtering yourself, sit in silence without discomfort, or wake up tangled in sheets and not rush to fix your hair or your face before being seen. It was in the way she knew exactly how I liked my coffee. Not just strong, but brewed in the French press and poured into the green mug with the chipped handle. It was in the way I'd hang her towels near the stove because she always forgot where she left them, and she'd giggle when she found them there. There was an invisible thread connecting all these things, and with each passing day, it only tightened. We started to share our pasts more freely now, not in bursts of confession, but in stories that surfaced naturally, while folding laundry, while taking slow walks down our street, or while lying in bed with nothing but moonlight in the room. Marie once told me about the time she drove to the coast alone for her 40th birthday and ate oysters until she cried, not from the taste, but from the loneliness she'd been trying to mask. I told her about a failed business I never talk about, the one that drained my savings and pride, and how it still haunted me on nights when the world went quiet. We didn't judge each other for those chapters. We honored them. They were the bridges that had carried us to now. One Sunday afternoon, while sitting under the backyard pergola surrounded by tomato vines and pots of lavender, she turned to me and said, "It still surprises me how much I like you." I laughed and replied, "It surprises me how much I needed you." There was something disarming about being needed in a way that didn't feel like pressure. She didn't need me to fix her or carry her burdens. She just needed my presence, my laughter, my partnership. And I needed her sense of place, her warmth, her belief that life didn't have to be loud to be meaningful. We started entertaining. The idea of doing something we never thought we'd do again. Building something for the future. For Marie, this meant picking up her art again. She had once painted watercolors but gave it up when her marriage dissolved and life turned pragmatic. I cleaned out a corner of the garage and converted it into a little studio, complete with a stool, a fan, and a small desk by the window. For me, it meant starting my handyman blog back up, something I'd dabbled with years ago before work, and weariness consumed my time. Now, with Marie cheering me on, I found myself writing again in the early mornings, sipping coffee as I typed out how-tos and stories from my trade. We were slowly becoming more than survivors of our pasts. We were becoming creators of our present. There was no denying that the world outside of us continued to turn with its usual chaos, but inside our home, there was sanctuary. Even the difficult conversations didn't feel like threats. They felt like tools. One evening, we sat across from each other and talked about finances, estate planning, the things that adults at our age sometimes avoid out of fear or habit. But we handled it like we handled everything else, head on, hand in hand, without drama. That night, I realized something deep and unshakable. I trusted her with my life, not just emotionally, but practically. She was the person I'd want in the room during a storm, in a hospital waiting room, at the edge of any uncertainty. The kind of person you don't just love, you rely on. And there's a rare kind of magic in that. One morning, as the seasons officially tilted toward winter and the ground outside wore a thin white frost, Marie came into the kitchen holding a small stack of papers. She looked nervous. I asked what they were, and she hesitated before saying, They're house plans. Well, sketches really. For the garden, and maybe a shed extension for your tools. Just ideas. She laid them on the table and began explaining each one. Her voice soft but excited, her finger tracing imaginary walls and walkways like she could already see it all built. I didn't interrupt her. I just watched the way she lit up. And in that moment, watching this woman at 52 dream out loud without apology, I felt something shift in me. A kind of confirmation that I hadn't stumbled into love. I'd walked straight into it with eyes open and a heart finally brave enough to hold it. Later that evening, after dinner and dishes and a slow dance in the living room to a song from 20 years ago, I found the plans again and added a note to the corner. Let's build it. All of it. I didn't need to ask if she knew what I meant. We were well past needing words for the things that mattered most. Every now and then, I'd still hear her ask that question from the very first week. Soft, vulnerable, uncertain. Would you stay with me, even if I'm 52? And every time it echoed in my mind, I felt this steady, unwavering voice inside me respond, I'd stay with you at 62, 72, or 92, because it was never about the number. It was about the soul. And hers? Hers was timeless. It was hard to describe, when exactly everything began to feel permanent. But at some point, the idea of staying for now quietly transitioned into, this is where I live. I hadn't signed a lease or forwarded mail, yet all the signs were there. My toothbrush had its own cup beside hers. My work boots rested against the door without being shuffled to a corner, and my jacket hung on the same hook every night beside hers. We no longer asked each other if the other would be home for dinner because it was assumed, like the way dusk brings in the porch light or the way morning starts with 2 mugs instead of 1. Marie's home had not just made space for me. It had grown around me. It wasn't a merger of 2 lives in a chaotic sense. It was more like water blending into water. The adjustments happened gradually and without fanfare. A new lamp by the bed because she liked to read late and I didn't mind the glow. A different kind of peanut butter in the pantry because I had never liked the chunky kind she swore by. She laughed when she caught me trying to get used to it and promised to always keep both. That gesture, the quiet decision to accommodate instead of demand, felt like a vow. We spent more time outside now. Perhaps because the silence of nature allowed us to breathe between the lines of our day-to-day. On Sundays, we would walk along the trails near the lake, sometimes talking endlessly, sometimes not saying a word. Both types of strolls equally valuable. Marie had a way of noticing things I overlooked. She'd point out a bird I would have missed, a patch of wildflowers I would have stepped past. That attention to detail made me more present too, not just with her, but with the world. I started seeing things differently, slowing down, listening deeper. One afternoon, we passed a young couple arguing near a trailhead. Their voices were sharp, and their energy restless. Marie squeezed my hand gently but said nothing. As we walked away, she finally whispered, I used to think love had to be loud to be real. But now I know. It's the quiet that lasts. That stayed with me. She wasn't always poetic, but when she was, it carved a mark in places I didn't know could still be touched. Around that time, I started noticing how she had stopped covering her silver hair. She'd dyed it for years, she admitted out of habit more than vanity. But one morning she stood in front of the mirror, looked at the roots growing in, and said, I think I like it like this. And just like that, she stopped pretending to be younger for the world. And the world, or at least mine, loved her more for it. There was a strength in her choice that was hard to explain, like she had declared ownership of her time, her beauty, her age, and refused to let society draw lines around her worth. I admired that deeply. My own insecurities were less visible but just as present. I was used to being useful, fixing, building, hauling. I worried what would happen when I couldn't do those things, when a bad knee or stiff back finally caught up to me. But being with her softened that fear. She didn't need me to be invincible. She just needed me to be there. There was one night that stands out in particular, when we sat outside as rain lightly tapped the roof above us. We were both under a blanket, the fire pit crackling low beside our feet. She turned to me and said, I never thought I'd be happy. Again. Not truly. I thought that door closed after everything fell apart. But you didn't just open a window. You built a whole new house. It was dramatic, but sincere. I didn't know what to say, so I just kissed her hand and whispered, "I was just trying to fix a kitchen." That made her laugh, the kind of laugh that takes over your whole body. We started planning a trip soon after that. Nothing extravagant. Just a cabin near the mountains for a week, some books, maybe a telescope. Marie had always wanted to learn more about constellations, and I figured it was time we looked upward together. The idea of building memories intentionally, not just letting them happen, became part of our rhythm too. We created rituals: Saturday morning pancakes, Tuesday movie nights with old classics, Friday drives to nowhere with no agenda but to end up somewhere new. It wasn't about spending money or doing big things. It was about doing them together. The consistency of it built a kind of emotional wealth I never thought I'd experience again. Every now and then we still got asked by people we knew, or strangers we met, what our story was. Marie would usually glance at me and smile before saying, "He came to fix something I thought was broken." Turned out, he fixed more than just the sink. And I'd usually just nod and say, "She made it easy to stay." But internally, I always felt something bigger, like this was the chapter of my life that had finally been written in a voice that sounded like mine. There was no pretending here, no performance, just truth. And that truth was soft and warm, and it stayed through storms. She once asked me what I thought made a home, and I remember telling her it wasn't the roof or the walls or the furniture. It was the feeling of being seen exactly as you are, and still being wanted. That's what she had given me. Every day. Without asking me to change, without molding me into someone new. Just presence, just love, just the quiet promise that I was enough, that we were. As the air shifted toward the later months of the year and the trees began to surrender their green, for softer yellows and reds, something between us started to settle more deeply, not into complacency, but into certainty. It was no longer just a sweet coincidence that our lives had aligned this way. It was becoming a chosen, deliberate life. Marie had started bringing home little things from the farmer's market each week: jars of honey, handmade soaps, apples she swore tasted like the ones from her childhood. I didn't say much about it, but I noticed she'd pick things she thought I'd like too. A cinnamon-spiced candle for the kitchen because she remembered I'd said my mother used to make mulled cider in the fall, or a wool scarf that she left hanging by the door before I even realized it had gotten that cold outside. Her gestures were quiet, but precise. They made me feel remembered in ways I hadn't even expected. I, in turn, had started taking better care of the garden. I was never much for plants before, but she mentioned once how much she loved sitting outside in the evenings surrounded by color. So I started learning. I dug up the old, cracked planter beds, replaced the soil, and spent afternoons at the nursery asking too many questions. I planted marigolds and lavender, tomato vines and bell peppers, and when she came out one day to find that the roses she'd once given up on had bloomed again, I saw something like tears behind her smile. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. But that was exactly why I did. Because I wasn't trying to impress her anymore. I was just trying to give back something equal to what I felt every day, some evidence that I was paying attention too. There was a day in late September, when we were sitting at the small table outside, coffee mugs in hand, the wind just beginning to feel like fall. Marie looked across at me, eyes searching mine for something. "Do you ever feel like we got here too late?" she asked. I set my mug down and leaned forward. "No, I think we got here just in time." She looked away, then back again. "Sometimes, I wish we had met when we were younger." I smiled. "If we had, I wouldn't have known what to do with someone like you. I would have missed it. I wasn't ready to see you then." That seemed to comfort her. The truth was, neither of us were trying to rewrite time, but every now and then, we mourned what could have been, only to cherish more what was. We'd both lived other lives, loved other people, lost in ways that reshaped us. And maybe it was that loss that made us more open to loving gently now. We never tried to possess each other, never clung out of fear. We met in the middle of our own becoming, and then just stayed there, growing together. One evening, we hosted a small dinner, just 2 neighbors and a couple of her old friends from the library. It wasn't fancy. Soup, bread, a bottle of red wine. But it felt full. The house glowed, and Marie moved through it like someone entirely at peace. At one point, someone asked how long we'd been together. I opened my mouth, unsure of how to answer. Marie simply said, "Long enough to know we're not going anywhere." And that was it. No fanfare, no labels, just truth. And in that moment, I realized how little I missed definitions. What we had didn't need them. It spoke for itself in every look, every plate set out, every night the lights stayed on a little longer because we were still talking on the couch. I kept fixing things around the house, not because they were broken, but because I liked making things better for her. She'd joke that if I kept improving everything, she'd have to start charging me rent. I'd tell her that the rent was already being paid, with laughter, with late-night ice cream runs, with the garden blooming stronger than ever. And sometimes, with nothing at all, just being beside each other, the silence of companionship, rich enough to say everything. There was a morning in early October when I woke up and found her already in the kitchen, standing by the window, coffee untouched, eyes lost in thought. I wrapped my arms around her waist and asked what was on her mind. She leaned back into me and whispered, "This feels like the part where people ask, what happens next?" I kissed her shoulder and said, "Maybe nothing happens. Maybe this is it." She turned and looked at me, serious and soft all at once. "And would that be enough for you?" I didn't even hesitate. "It already is." That morning turned into a lazy afternoon. We sat outside in the hammock we'd strung between 2 old trees. The dogs lay in the grass, the sun warm, but not hot, a breeze carrying the smell of the earth. Marie reached out and took my hand, her fingers weaving through mine like threads long overdue for stitching. "You ever think about getting married?" she asked suddenly. I turned my head slowly, studying her profile. "Do you?" She smiled faintly. "Sometimes. Not because I need it. Just because I like the idea of telling the world what I already know." I squeezed her hand. "You've already told me. That's the only world I care about." But I knew what she meant, and I wasn't opposed. The thought of standing with her somewhere quiet, saying something meaningful in front of the people who mattered, that wasn't something I feared. It just felt optional, like a cherry on top of something already whole. We didn't rush the conversation. We let it sit there, like so many others we'd had, open, honest, and patient. The future didn't scare us anymore. We'd already been through storms. Now, every day felt like sunlight after the rain. October gave way to November, and the air began to sharpen, curling through the trees and brushing across the window panes like a whispered reminder that time was moving forward, whether we were ready or not. The garden began to fade, the last of the tomatoes picked, the lavender trimmed back, and Marie and I spent more time inside, layering up in wool and sharing more evenings by the fire. The rhythm of our life had settled into something that felt sacred, unrushed, simple, and sincere. There were no grand events, no dramatic turns, but every day held meaning in the small details. She started teaching me how to cook, not in a formal way, but more like an exchange of rituals passed down. From memories she hadn't visited in years, we would stand side by side in the kitchen, chopping and stirring, music from decades past playing in the background as flour dusted the countertops, and our laughter filled the space more surely than any candle or light ever could. I had never known how much joy could come from peeling apples or folding dough until I saw the pride in her face when I got a recipe right. It was never about the food, though. It was the fact that we were building something together, something ordinary, but ours. The dog we adopted, Penny, had grown into her role as a permanent fixture in the home. She followed us from room to room like a shadow stitched with devotion. Marie often joked that the dog had bonded with me more, but the truth was, Penny had simply become another thread in this quilt we were making together, woven with shared routines and gentle companionship. On one particularly windy day, Marie brought down a box from the attic. It was filled with old photo albums, letters, and fragments of a past life. Things from her childhood, her marriage, the years she spent alone. We sat together on the floor, the wind howling beyond the walls, flipping through pages of a story I had never read before. She showed me pictures of her as a child, standing on a beach with hair like wildfire, eyes defiant and curious. She told me about her first job at the library, and how terrified she was to speak in front of a room full of people, only to become the head of the reading program within a year. She showed me a photograph of her and her late husband, not with sorrow, but with reverence. He was kind, she said, but not meant to walk my whole life with me. We were right for a season, and I think he would have liked you. I didn't press, didn't dissect that. I just held her hand a little tighter and let the silence be a cushion for her truth. That night, after she had gone to bed, I stayed up and looked through the rest of the albums alone. It felt like flipping through the pages of a story that had waited patiently for a reader who would understand. And somewhere in those fading photos and penciled notes, I realized just how many chapters she had lived before me, and how lucky I was to be in this one. The following weekend, her niece came to visit. Young, bright-eyed, and curious, she was one of the few family members who had stayed close. Watching the two of them together was like catching a glimpse into the woman Marie had been at 30. Sharp, funny, and endlessly giving. Over dinner, her niece asked how long we'd been together. Marie looked at me and smiled. Long enough to stop counting. After the girl had left, she turned to me and asked, "Did that sound strange?" I shook my head. It sounded like truth. We never talked about anniversaries or milestones. We marked our days by the feeling they left behind. The quiet comfort of waking up to the smell of coffee. The way she hummed when she cleaned. The way I always left my boots near the door even though she had asked me 100 times to move them. We marked our time by the laughter in the kitchen, the soft arguments over which show to binge, the shared silence at night when the world outside fell away. And somehow, those moments accumulated into something sturdier than a label. They became the framework of a life. One day, Marie asked if I had ever considered writing any of this down. Not for anyone else, just for us. At first, I brushed it off. I wasn't a writer. I barely journaled. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she was right. This story, our story, deserved to be preserved. Not because it was extraordinary in the traditional sense, but because it had healed something in both of us. So I began to write. Nothing fancy, just a few paragraphs a night, recounting how we met, the way she looked that first day in the kitchen, the time we danced under the porch light during a summer storm, the letter she left on my workbench the day I fixed her back fence. It wasn't literature, it was just love, in its most honest form. She read the first few entries one evening, curled up on the couch with her glasses slipping down her nose, and when she finished, she didn't say anything. She just leaned over and kissed my forehead. "You remembered all of it," she whispered. And I had. Because how could I forget? This woman had taken the quietest parts of me and brought them to life again. She had given me a home not made of bricks or wood, but of warmth and unwavering presence. And I, without even realizing it, had become something steady for her too. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and still we stayed in rhythm. Every part of our life felt earned. Each smile, each silence, each nightfall wrapped in gentle understanding. And as winter crept closer, as the wind thickened and the world outside hushed under frost, we leaned in closer to one another. Not for heat, but for the kind of closeness that says, "I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere." Winter wrapped the house in a quiet stillness that felt like both a blanket and a test, slowing everything down to the pace of breath and memory. The snow came soft and steady that year, dusting the fence lines and piling up against the corners of the porch, muting the sounds of the world outside and turning our little space into something that felt suspended from time. Marie took to wearing thick sweaters and brewing tea every few hours, the aroma of ginger and cinnamon becoming the background of our days. I split wood in the mornings, shoveled the walk in the afternoons, and wrote in the evenings. The journal I had started for her, and for me, grew heavier. The pages now thick with moments that would have otherwise melted into the noise of ordinary life. She called it our book. I never corrected her. I didn't want to. Because, in every sentence, every line, her presence was there, shaping the meaning behind each word. Sometimes we sat together while I wrote. Sometimes she read by the fire, or worked on a puzzle, or simply stared out the window with that faraway look. That made me wonder what version of herself she was talking to inside her head. She'd say things like, "I never thought I'd feel this full again," or, "I forgot how much a quiet day could mean." And I knew she meant them. Not as confessions, but as observations of a life she had learned to savor. One night, we heard a loud crack. Ice from the pines snapped and fell hard onto the shed roof. Marie jumped a little, then laughed and tucked her feet under the blanket tighter. "Nature's knocking," she joked. "Tell it we're not interested." I smiled and added another log to the fire, watching as the sparks lit up her face. It was strange, in a beautiful way, how deeply we had come to understand each other without having to explain ourselves constantly. There was no pressure to perform, no masks, just presence, just being. I think that's what made everything so sustainable. The absence of pressure, the presence of acceptance. Around late January, I had to take a short trip out of town to handle a family matter. An old uncle's estate needed sorting. Marie insisted I go, promised to keep the house in one piece. I was gone for 4 days. It wasn't long, but it felt like forever. I hadn't realized how tightly woven into her rhythm I had become until I found myself reaching for her hand in the passenger seat of a rental car, or glancing over to tell her something at breakfast in a diner where I sat alone. When I came back, she was waiting on the porch in her coat, steaming mug in hand, cheeks pink from the cold. She didn't run to me or make a scene. She just smiled and said, "Welcome home." And I knew then, without a doubt, that this wasn't just a chapter. It was the whole book. In February, we celebrated her birthday. Nothing grand, just a candle and a homemade pie, a card with the worst drawing I've ever done, and a slow dance in the living room to a song she used to love in her 20s. She rested her head against my shoulder and whispered, "You make me feel younger than I ever did in my 30s. I kissed her hair and said, "You make me feel like I never left." We talked about spring that night, about planting herbs again, maybe painting the back room. We even tossed around the idea of getting a second dog, not to replace the first one, but to expand the team. And then, in a moment of soft boldness, she said it again. "Would you take me as your wife at 52? I'm still serious." And I laughed, not at her, but with her, because the question wasn't a shock anymore. It was part of our language. I didn't get down on one knee. I didn't pull out a ring. I just said, "Yes," not because you asked, but because I already did. We didn't rush to the courthouse or throw a party. We made it official in our own way. A quiet ceremony in the backyard once the thaw came, with just a few close friends, and her niece standing beside her, grinning like she'd known all along that this was where things were headed. I built a small arch from driftwood we found on a road trip, and she wore a dress she hadn't planned on needing again. There were wildflowers in her hair, and a joy in her eyes I hadn't seen in anyone before. We said our vows in the language we'd been speaking since I first stepped into her kitchen. Simple, true, and rooted in presence. Afterward, we danced under the stars as the neighbors lit sparklers from across the fence. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter and old jazz on the record player, I realized that love doesn't always knock you off your feet. Sometimes, it just walks in quietly, sets down a bag, and starts making soup. It isn't always about fireworks. Sometimes, it's about the steady heat of a stove and the smell of rosemary in the air. Now, every evening feels like a continuation of that dance. We still argue over what to watch. We still burn toast sometimes. But we also know how to apologize without ego, how to listen without waiting for our turn to speak. She still laughs at my bad puns, and I still act like I'm shocked when she outsmarts me at Scrabble. And every so often, when the world feels a bit too loud, we turn off everything and sit in the quiet, holding hands and remembering the first time I fixed her sink. If someone had told me years ago that I'd fall in love again in a small town kitchen with a woman who challenged me to grow without ever raising her voice, I wouldn't have believed them. But here I am. Here we are. Writing new chapters, one day at a time, never needing a perfect ending, just a present one. And that, I think, is the most honest kind of love there is. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.